Welcome to episode number 16 of our podcast. Today, I'm going to do a semi-technical talk on the DAISY theory of retail and give some details on how we simulate the future for retail and how we can optimize merchandise planning using AI. We simulate the future and try to find an optimal future. And the key challenge in retail is that it's optimizing the combinations of items, right? Because items are related. If you think of items in a meal, ground beef, you're making hamburgers, you buy condiments, buns, onions, pickles, toppings, French fries, other sides. So there's affinities between items. So products are related. And so when doing a promotion, it's important to decide what products to promote and importantly, what products not to promote. So although we're coming at this from the promotional lens, it's also optimizing the full merchandising mix for regular products as well as promotional products. So a typical retailer, a grocer might have 50,000 items in their assortment. And if you were to choose the optimal 2,000 items to promote, which might be all the items you might promote in a week, be your flyer, your e-commerce, your in-store, your direct. So all the different items you list on your promotions, you might be promoting something like that. But if you do 50,000 choose 2,000, which is the combinatorial math, that is 10 to the power of 3,600. So that's a number one with 3,600 zeros. So that's a massive number. That's more than the number of molecules in the universe. The latest estimate of the number of molecules in the universe is about 10 to the 80. So retail is much more complex than the universe. So this is why it's beyond human ability to choose the optimal combination. So I'll talk about how DAISY's AI approach can help choose an optimal mix, maybe not the global optimal because it's impossible to choose 3,600 even with all the computing power in the world, but we can do a much better job than people can just because it's computationally beyond human ability. Not to say that people do a bad job, it's just that computers can do something that people can't. So we create a DAISY rank. We rank every decision you make right at the micro level. So the decisions retailers are making on a weekly basis or daily basis or intra-daily if you're e-commerce would be what are the items you promote? What are the prices for those items, both regular and non-promotional? So that means every item has a price point, regular and promotional price point, and it could be at region by store region. So DAISY ranks all these decisions. These are the decisions that retailers make, and we can use this rank and we'll show you how it's a leading indicator of the future outcomes and it's optimizing the combination, right? And so the things that go into DAISY's theory of retail, which I'll kind of unpack as we go through here, DAISY's theory of retail takes into account all those halo effects, which I'll talk about, the associated sales, the fact that items go together, some items cannibalize others because you bought one brand, cannibalized another, forward buying because on sale you stocked up. In addition, all the common factors, we know seasonality is an impact. What consumers buy at Christmas time or in the winter is very different than what they buy in the summer. Obviously, any of those holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Ramadan, Eid, Valentine's Day, all of these holidays and other events have an impact on what items are bought. Obviously, price and promotional elasticity of items matter. Recent items purchased, recent promotions, your competitive products, all of these are things that impact the future performance of retail. And so DAISY takes all of these things into account as it simulates the optimal merchandise plan. So I'll go first all what we call total store impact. And this is what we're trying to maximize is the total store impact. This could be a sales measure, could be a gross margin measure, could be a transaction or traffic measure. So typically you have sales, baseline sales that occur when things are not promoted. Typically, those would have a high margin, like in this example, 25.5%. Now, this could be a single item, or it could be the aggregate of all items across a week, both promotional and non-promotional. You would have full price sales above the baseline. So if you promoted an item, typically this is what it would have sold if you had been able to sell it at full price, but you invested in a discount. That's a negative. So that's the price investment you made. You might have then achieved vendor funding to offset some of that price change, and then you have a net incremental sales impact. Because of the promotion and the price, you're able to generate incremental sales. Typically, that's at a cost of margin. Usually, you're promoting promoting and discounting. So you might have 10% net incremental margin on those promoted items. But the key thing here is the halo. These are the items that are purchased that are related to the item you promoted, as I talked about that ground beef example, pasta, tomato sauce, cheese, bread, wine, salad fixing. Now, the key is not to promote those halo items, as many of those as you can, because they're bought anyway. So if you promote the halo driver, the items in the halo can be sold at full margin. So you can see the margin of the incremental halo is 22%. So close to that unpromoted margin. There'll be some other promoted items there, so it'll be a little bit less. Then we have cannibalization and pantry loading or forward buying. And ultimately, the net impact of all of those things is what we call the total store impact. And if you do it right and don't promote the items that aren't necessary to promote, you can have a blended margin that's closer to the unpromoted margin. So you can have a price impact, a margin impact without even touching price, just by deciding what to promote or not promote. You can add on to that lost sales due to stockouts. So you might have had inaccurate forecasting and ordering, and then there's a gap between not following what the AI recommends. The AI has an optimal plan, so we can measure these impacts. So this is what we can measure and optimize. This is what Daisy's AI is optimizing. From this, we can calculate the promotional effectiveness, which is the ratio of total store impact over baseline sales. What did my promotion result in on a single item, or on a channel promotion, or on all my promotions for the whole week? You can measure this at any level of the hierarchy. We can measure your pricing effectiveness, which is looking at the gross margin percentage at the total store level over the baseline. We can measure promotional turn, as I said, which is the ratio of TSI over baseline sales, and we can measure the forecasting and allocation efficiency. So this is a good way to measure all the things, and this is what the AI is optimizing and simulating. The really interesting thing is total store impact. When we plot this is just an example from one of our customers. Each dot is a weekly result, an overall weekly result across all promotions. And this is a total store impact versus comparable store sales. So we can see this is a strongly correlated. In this example, the correlation coefficient's about 0.6. We've seen it in many customers as high as 0.9, where showing that the better the total store impact in a single week, the higher the overall comparable store sales. And so the year-over-year difference in total store impact will be strongly correlated to year-over-year comparable store sales impact. So if you want to grow sales year over year, have good performing weeks by using the promotion to leverage that and create incremental total store impact. So just some definitions. We can divide weekly sales in a retailer is divided by promotion transactions. So promo sales are those transactions that have at least one promoted item in them, versus non-promoted sales or non-promoted transactions would be transactions or baskets that have no promoted items in them. And then there's, within the promoted transactions, there's promoted items. So these are the items that you promoted. There's other promoted items. So one item, if you're thinking of ground beef in a transaction that was promoted, there could be other promoted items that are in the same transactions that are bought along with the ground beef. So that's, the other promoted item requires you to choose the context of one other promoted item, and you can see other promoted items. And then there's associated items that are in the transaction. Some of these would be non-promoted associated items that are in the same transaction with the promoted item. So these are just facts. They're not modeled metrics. And so the goal here is we want to be able to optimize the item relationships, right? So optimize those affinities, what you promote and what you don't promote, so that the optimized promo sales plus the non-promo sales, that the sum of those two things is larger than unoptimized promo sales and non-promo sales. We don't want to steal non-promo sales to optimize promo. We want to make sure we increase the sum and grow overall total weekly sales. So optimizing these item relationships, these affinities that occur, and all the other factors, we can maximize overall total weekly sales. That's the objective. And so how do you measure, going back to that waterfall, how do we measure baseline sales? Very complicated thing. Show you several examples here. If we plotted sales of an item, there's baseline sales for seasonal items, baseline sales for items that are promotional sensitive, baseline sales for items that are promoted almost every week, baseline sales for items with limited history. These are 4 different cases. So here we can see lozenge sales, typically related to flu season or colds, which happen more in the winter. So you can see as a seasonal pattern. The blue line would be the net sales of lozenges on a weekly basis. And from that, we can compute baseline sales. So we can calculate a complicated filter, which calculates a baseline. And you can see some weeks the sales are above the baseline, some weeks they're below. You can likely tell which weeks are promotions because they're the very large gaps above baseline sales. And then some weeks, because of the promotion, sales drop below the baseline. And sometimes sales is not a straight line, so wobbles a little bit around the baseline. Here's an item that's not seasonal, but it's very promotionally sensitive. Every time you promote it, you get a massive spike. So when you're calculating baselines, you want to eliminate high frequency promotional noise. So this is why we use signal processing filters to calculate baseline, the orange line being the baseline there. Here's an item like salted snacks, potato chips, which are promoted almost every week. So it's very hard to determine a baseline for an item that's promoted every week or almost every week. So here it's more, again, the baseline, and the filter ends up being more kind of what's an average promotion. And so you can see above and below average promotions. That's a measurement. Items that are new that have very limited history. So you can see here's a new artisan bread that starts out at almost 0 and over time it grows. So there typically we just do a simple linear regression to calculate a baseline and use that as an estimate of above and below sales. There's many other cases. So this is how you typically calculate baselines using the transaction history that's associated with an item. And then to calculate the incremental lift, it's simply the difference between the item sales, the blue line and the orange line. That's the incremental lift in an individual week. You can here see maybe an item was TPR'd, a temporary price reduction for multiple weeks, and you can see it was above the baseline for multiple weeks. In some cases, the sales lift could be negative. It can be below the baseline. So we can determine if it's above or below the baseline during a promotion or a non-promotional week. And so we can measure, once we calculate the baselines, we can calculate those incremental items. And similarly, we can plot associated sales in exactly the same way, the blue line being associated sales, which again are all the other items in the basket that were in the basket with the promoted items. And we can calculate their baselines. And I'll show you how we define associated sales. But the baseline methodology for associated sales is identical. So an example, you promote ground beef, customers going to make hamburgers, they buy condiments, buns, or they're making pasta, they're buying tomato sauce, you're making Mexican night, you're buying taco shells and produce. So these are some of the affinities that are associated with ground beef. We can then take a transaction and we can define it, and just definitionally, we can say on this receipt, what are the promoted items? So we can see the items that had a promotional, they're the green items. So you can see tomato paste was at $1.14, now $1.02. The baking soda at 61, now 59. The spaghetti was at 238, now 218. So you can see the promotional message. So all of those items are now classified as promoted items. All of the other items, the purple dots, are classified as non-promoted items. We can look at what are the associated items with tomato sauces. So if we consider tomato sauces being tomato paste and tomato sauce, we can look at all the other gray dots, some of those being promoted items and non-promoted items are now just associated with tomato sauces. We can see what are the associated non-promo items. They're the dark green dots associated with tomato sauces. And then we can see the associated other promo sales with tomato sauce. That's kind of the olive green dot there. So these are just definitions that we can apply across your transactions. And so these buckets of associated sales and promoted sales and non-promoted sales are simply a fact that we can add up across your transaction receipts. So it's not a model, it's a real fact. Now, the thing is, some of these facts are non-additive. If you're looking at transactions, we know transactions is typically a non-additive fact. So looking at that previous transaction, if we were to say, what are the associated sales with tomato sauce? We can see all of the other items would be considered associated sales with tomato sauce. This has nothing to do with causality, doesn't necessarily mean it's causal, although causality is a very complex discussion. We can say there's more causality than you think in these items. And you can look at then pie shells. having all the same associated items as tomato sauce in that same transaction. And if you were to ask what are the associated sales for tomato sauce and pie shells, you can't add all the items together because that'd be duplicating. So when you look at the associated items for tomato sauce and pie shells, you can only count those items once. So we net out the duplicates. It's a non-additive fact. So we can deduplicate the associated sales metric, but it's a fact based on actual transaction receipts. And we can efficiently count this with mass scale computing. So we can determine these associated sales. And the very interesting thing we find when you plot associated sales versus the sales, in this case, it's Nutella. Every dot on this graph is a weeks of sales. And we can plot on the vertical axis, we show weekly Nutella sales. And on the horizontal axis, we show weekly the associated items in the same transactions as Nutella. And so we can see the ratio is constant. The slope of that line is 26:1. So for every dollar of Nutella sales, you have $26 of other items. This is about 3 years of data. I think there's about 150 dots there. So over a long period of time, over a range in sales of Nutella of about 300%, from the lowest being $3,000 up to about $12,000 or $11,000, this relationship holds. So if you can increase the sales of Nutella from the average by 10%, moving from 6,500 to 7,000, you will increase associated sales by 26 times that. And that's the game to play. Every high frequency item has a similar pattern to this, and that's the game. Some have different slopes. It's not 26:1. Some will have 2:1. I know that beer off the top of my head has a ratio of about 2:1. Bananas has about 7 or 8:1. And it's a measure of the penetration of the item. How many transactions does it occur in? What's the baseline sales? So although Nutella has a very high ratio, it also has a small dollar amount. Although bananas has a lower ratio, it has a very high weekly sales amount and a high penetration. So the game here is what are the combinations of items you can promote to create an incremental lift in that item that will create that incremental associated sales that you recall from that waterfall bar, by taking advantage of the fact that these halo ratios exist for all your high frequency items, which is probably about 60 to 80% of your assortment. So that's the game to be played here. Cannibalization is something we can also measure. So we measure direct cannibalization. So because the customer bought Coke, they didn't buy Pepsi. Indirect cannibalization will be because you bought hamburger patties and the associated sales was hamburger buns. The associated item indirectly cannibalizes hot dog buns. Direct cannibalization is you didn't buy hot dogs because you bought hamburger patties. The indirect cannibalization is hamburger buns cannibalizes hot dog buns. So we can measure both of these impacts. We can identify an anti-group for each item to say what are the items that are negatively correlated to every single item. So these are the items that reflect consumer choice. It's not a perfect science. We can measure the items typically within the same area of the product hierarchy. We know that steaks are negatively correlated to toilet brushes, but that doesn't mean that the toilet brush is in the consumer choice set of a steak. So typically you limit looking for the consumer choice set to be in the similar area of product hierarchy. And we can then plot, again, baseline sales of an item. So here we can see this item is a 4-pack of chocolate. We can see the blue line being the sales of that item. We can see the orange line being the baseline sales of chocolate. And we can see a promotion happening in an item that's negatively correlated to chocolate. So you can see those red dots are promotions in items that are in the anti-group of chocolates. So we can see those promotions cause chocolate sales to go below its baseline. And we can measure the difference between the orange line and the blue line on those promotional week as contributing to the cannibalization of the item that was promoted on the red dot. So we can measure that. The direct cannibalization here is negative 19K for this particular week. And we can measure associated sales, which isn't shown on this graph, but there's a negative cannibalization of that here. And we can look at other items, drumsticks, we can look at grocery bags, similar things that the item sales go below the baseline when a cannibalized item is promoted. And so We can measure this effect again using those baselines, using the actual sales, and looking at the difference between the actual sales and the baseline sales. Forward buying in an item would be a customer stocking up. So there's two reasons that stock kind of this effect happens. One is because it's on sale, the customer buys more than they need in the coming week. Also, the product might have a long life cycle. So if you're buying a big detergent that could last a month, once you've bought one pack of detergent, you may not need it for a couple months. And if it's on sale, you might buy 2 or 3 months supply. So you might be out of the market for a while. So this is affecting the forward demand. We calculate this only directly at the item level, not forward buying on the halo items, because that's much too complicated to calculate. So here we can see when you promote an item, the red dots are promotions, the sales lift spikes, the blue line is the sale, the orange is the baseline. We can see on subsequent weeks for the promotion, the sales typically drops immediately, most after the first week. We can calculate for each item what the effect of that promotion is. We can calculate the promotional period. Every item has a cadence. In this case, Villaggio sliced bread, we've calculated has about typically a 2-week promotional impact. And you can see that after the red dot, sales will decline typically for 1 or 2 weeks before it returns to its promotion. We can measure that gap between the baseline and that subsequent weeks to a promotion. That gap is now the forward buying loss. And again, sometimes both the cannibalization and forward buying can be positive because there are other correlation effects going on. If there's an item that's being promoted that positively impacts Villaggio sliced bread in the weeks after the sliced bread promotion, that could reduce the cannibalization, in fact, make it positive in some cases. So these effects are very complicated. If you have 50,000 items, you have billions of affinity patterns. But in general, when you promote an item, you'll see in subsequent weeks its demand declines, and typically declines under the baseline. And you can see different items here, pet food. You can see here soap. This is, again, once you buy one, it lasts, especially if you're buying an 8-pack of soap, you're out of the market for a while. So you can see a big gap afterwards. So just a reminder, we've kind of gone through how we calculate baseline sales, how we calculate the increment over baseline, what's on this incremental associated sales. There's an increment over the baseline associated sales. And remember, the baseline associated sales to the baseline sales was that halo ratio, falls on a straight line, and the sum of the baseline plus incremental for sales and halo sales still falls on that line. Similarly, there's a ratio of cannibalized and sales to its baselines. These also fall on straight lines. So it's amazing. These halo patterns are very constant. Why? Because consumers are creatures of habit. How consumers use the products don't change. You know, what you do with a box of Cheerios is the same that you've done with a box of Cheerios for decades, ever since they've been out. You buy Cheerios, you make cereal, you buy milk, you might buy sugar. There's certain items, those very strong product patterns dominate. The recipe for pasta bolognese has not changed for 1,000 years. These effects are stronger than COVID. Seasonal effects are stronger than the pandemic. You know, what you buy at Christmas time versus what you buy in the summer during barbecue season, very different. These customer use case patterns are much stronger than the volume trends that occur. And so if you're looking at these patterns are what you need to look at, because they're very long lasting and they are unchanging over time. You might have new patterns appear, but the pattern itself stays the same. And the fact that consumers have very limited budgets, you don't spend $100 on groceries one week and then $1,000 the next week. Typically, the variance in customer budget on food spend is very fixed as well. So when you combine the fixed budget and the use case of how customers use products, you get very repetitive patterns, and you get these strong halo effects and these halo ratios that occur in data. And this is what we can take advantage of and use that to optimize the total store impact by choosing items that drive a large halo, that drive large penetration, which means many consumers are interested in, with a high halo ratio, that are strongly elastic, so you can drive a large incremental associated sales, and all at full margin or close to full margin. That's the game to play, but it's beyond human ability because you have billions of patterns and beyond infinity number of possible combinations that you can promote. So this is describing a reinforcement learning paradigm that simulates the future. We generate, it's a form of generative AI in that we're generating promotional plans, full merchandise plans, simulating using a mathematical theory of retail that's independent of the data. Attributes are intelligently machine learned from the data. So we used human knowledge to create the theory, and then we simulate using reinforcement learning and computational AI to find the optimal decision-making set, which results in increased sales. 5% for a $100 billion company, we can grow sales by $5 billion. We have a track record of showing that. The challenge is change management to existing processes, which I've talked about before. Thank you very much for tuning in. Love to have a chat. If you're interested, feel free to reach out with comments and questions. And you can subscribe on Spotify and YouTube to this channel. And thanks so much.